Welcome to the Liberty North Show. I'm Simon Essler.
I'm Michael Mangoni.
And today we're going to touch on the climate change narrative according to some events that have occurred in Alberta with extreme weather, energy prices, and all sorts of nonsense. So we're going to dive into a whole bunch of sources to look at what's really going on there and how it's affecting the people of Alberta and what it means for the people of the world.
The Trudeau regime.
The New World Order agenda.
Canadian Insight.
Without free thought, there's no free will. We can't even say that this is Democrat or Republican.
That is not a left-wing, right-wing issue.
It's a world economic forum.
Communist warfare, communist warfare, communist warfare.
Canada's reputation. Fifth generation warfare.
The line between citizen and soldier is gone.
So in Alberta, the temperatures have reached -40. Some are saying -50 with the wind chill. These are very dramatic and very intense, not particularly normal temperatures, but they do happen in Canada because, it's the Great White North. Something similar happened in Texas, and people died because they don't have the right infrastructure to sustain this onslaught of cold weather. But so in Alberta, in Canada, we are much more prepared for these types of weather events. But as we're seeing, the energy grid in Alberta has not been able to keep up with the energy demand in this abnormal period of extreme weather.
Yeah, and it's, due to the modifications that are being driven by climate change. I saw some, interesting stuff about how people's electric cars were actually dying halfway to where they were trying to go in Alberta because their electric battery just couldn't sustain the amount of energy needed to travel through that kind of weather. We're looking at the alleged solutions to alleged climate change sort of failing in the face of real weather conditions. And there's lots of spin going on, of course, but this is interesting because I know that Alberta is looking for energy independence right now. And there's a big power struggle between the province of Alberta and the federal government, especially in terms of the climate change agenda and this whole idea of carbon footprint and carbon capture. There's, I guess, a lot to sort through, but the main thing that's going on now is that climate change-based policies have crippled a province that should, like you said, be totally ready for this kind of weather. This isn't a surprise to Canadians. This shouldn't be a surprise in terms of the way that our infrastructure is built. And now it's actually endangering people. We're dealing with blackouts while people are in very, very severe weather conditions. There's videos going around the internet of Albertans going outside and, freezing things like freezing their noodle bowls as they pick it up with the chopsticks and all sorts of wild stuff to give people a sense of how extreme this really is. And I think there's not only the government to consider, but I guess there's corruption in the energy companies as well. And this is something that we were digging around and found out that we have TransAlta, who, CBC put out this article back in 2015. They actually got caught in the midst of market manipulation. So TransAlta was allegedly creating timed blackouts so that they could raise the prices on customers.
Can you give a bit of a context to what TransAlta is? Because in Canada, the energy sector works a little differently than in the US.
Yeah, so in Canada, you end up having these energy companies that are basically in bed with the government. So there's an agreement that one corporation gets to essentially dominate the energy sector for
Have a complete monopoly, actually, yeah, for a certain amount of years, right?
So like here in Ontario, we deal with Enercare. So they get these monopolies according to these government contracts. So TransAlta in 2015, this report is based on this company. They were the chosen one, but then they got caught and had to pay $56 million for market manipulation. Now, because they have a total monopoly, I don't know how much $56 million really is to a company like that.
It's a joke, actually.
Right? Like this might just be worth what they did, the actual money that they made timing these blackouts so that they could manipulate the market. This might have actually made them so much money that that's just a drop in the bucket. It's ridiculous.
It's reminiscent actually of the fines on big pharma companies. Actually, you have these big pharma companies that make hundreds of billion-dollar profits, and they get smacked with even $1 billion fine. It's like the cost of doing business, right?
It's nonsense.
What's very absurd here is that the way Canada is run is essentially a semi-socialist country where we have healthcare and the energy sector and public education, whatnot, are run by the government. So TransAlta is not a government corporation, but in some senses, it's syndicated by the government and is an extension of the government because it has this contract with them for a certain amount of time. So you have this company that is entrusted as, working for the people, working for the people of Alberta, and it is actually subversively finding a way to now put in danger Albertans, right? This is years ago, but this is a perfect example of the corruption that is behind the scenes in the energy sector. Then when you have, people like Stephen Guilbeault, the environment minister, they're having backdoor conversations and doing weird things like this, which it's hard to imagine what's going through these people's minds. But there's so much corruption, and they actually, I believe, excuse themselves of it because of their obsession with this climate change narrative, right? You have Justin Trudeau and all these people that essentially the first thing that they tout out of their mouth when he's bragging about the Liberal Party's accomplishments, now it's gone to the second thing. So now you'll hear him say maybe healthcare first, and then it's fighting climate change. This guy knows nothing about climate change. You know, and you can tell that he wants it to be the first thing that comes out of his mouth every time. He's like, conservatives aren't fighting climate change. This man, if you tried to have a 5-minute debate with him about the basic science of climate change, of carbon dioxide, of emissions, this guy would come off as the biggest clown, right? And that's something that frustrates me the most, is that in Parliament, when you have Trudeau saying this nonsense like, we fight climate change and this is our goal as Canadians. First of all, Canadians don't give a damn about climate change. We're 33 million people. We're like 0.0001% of the population of the world. It does nothing. All of these policies just completely damage our way of life. But it frustrates the heck out of me that Pierre Poilievre on the Conservative side doesn't say, okay, you can't just say that without having any kind of debate or reproach. Let's debate this idea of climate change. And now you're seeing also Danielle Smith in Alberta, who is incorporating this idea of net neutrality or of net zero by 2050, combating the idea that Justin Trudeau wants it in 2030, but still they're talking about net neutrality like it's necessary. It's completely unnecessary. Their narrative of climate change is wrong.
100%. So you have this like false narrative, which is essentially like a psychological operation, right? They have this ongoing stream of propaganda to psychologically operate on the public, to create this notion that humans are destroying the planet in these very specific ways that feed this narrative. It is tough when you don't have the Conservatives ever challenging the narrative itself. So you're right, they submit to it. And then at the same time, you have these corporations who not only are they sort of linked into the government, right, with these government contracts, but then the corporations are also beholden to their ESG scores. And the ESG score, that's their environmental, social, and governance score, which is essentially, it's tied into the sort of neo-Marxist push.
It's just verbal diarrhea, actually.
It's verbal diarrhea. That is. And it's all about like giving these, basically, it's like a social credit system for corporations. So in their environmental score, they'll do things like, they'll make some sort of company sacrifice to the climate change narrative, and that's supposed to drive up their ESG score. And the ESG score is what gives them access to pools of liquidity. So corporations that don't submit to the neo-Marxist driven ESG score, they lose access to pools of liquidity. So they have the pressure of the ESG score, which is this, corporate social credit score, and they're in bed with the government. And it creates this horrible, horrible mess in which these corporations are beholden to anyone but the citizens, even though their whole job is to provide to the energy grid of the citizens. And, it really reminds me of the way that the US government has used social media corporations to get around free speech laws, and to attack the freedom of speech in the US, because all they'll do is, they lean on Facebook and say, we really need you to combat disinformation here, here, and here, and here. And we saw this was all dropped in the Twitter files, all the paper trail of the US government using social media corporations and big tech corporations to get around things. I think it's the same thing here with TransAlta and these big energy corporations. It allows the Canadian government to get around Canadian laws to say, well, it's not really us, it's these corporations, when in fact things like these timed rolling blackouts that TransAlta was caught performing, that actually supports the climate change narrative that is being driven by the Trudeau government. So you can see how them having a sort of corporate arm in this game, it allows the Trudeau government to benefit from these schemes, to create these very minimal fines for these corporations. And all of this drives along the climate change agenda that Trudeau benefits from greatly and ties him into institutions on the global stage like the World Economic Forum, and empowers him to work with these globalist institutions to continue to disempower Canadians on so many different levels. And I think, when you look at like the United Nations Agenda 2030 and their goals for sustainable development, this ties all of that into the school system as well. So you have all of this propaganda going on in the media, and you have even Conservative Party members being beholden to this climate change narrative. And at the same time, they are indoctrinating a generation of kids into this climate change narrative so that when they become politicians and leaders in our community, the pushback will be almost non-existent. You won't even have people, like there is some small pushback in the Conservatives saying, well, we won't agree with that policy. You'll have full commitment to all of this because they will have been entirely trained in this narrative. They won't be able to challenge it at all. So, I think it's worth maybe looking at a couple of our sources that do challenge this narrative because there's plenty of scientists that go against it. Of course, much like COVID, they are then blacklisted, they lose their jobs, there's character assassination that is performed on them.
The climate change science world is actually weirdly very corrupt, and there's a lot of intimidation and a lot of blacklisting, and it's odd. It's this community of scientists that technically they should just be not opinionated at all. They should just be doing the science, and whatever comes out of that is what they present to politicians as their advisors. But the problem is the way it's set up, the way the universities are set up, and the grants that these scientists get are completely tied to what they're researching and the results of their research. And it's a very corrupt world that we won't have time to go into today, but you have to think about these people that are funding it. You have the Justin Trudeau and these people that are brainwashed from, kindergarten to, PhD, that climate change is going to destroy the world. So we have to stop using fossil fuels. And so the funding it comes with a caveat. It comes with a link that is, if you don't push this narrative that the climate is actually warming because of man-made climate change, then you're not going to get funding. And it's not even explicit. It's just implicit. It's inherent in the nature of how the academic world works. So let's look at a couple of these sources that just very simply state what should not be controversial statements, right, about science and about
of course,
the sun and the impact on
exactly. The whole point is that science is debate. Science is constant debate. Science is not something that really gets totally settled. The idea of science is to be able to constantly question and challenge and debate. So these are dissenting scientists who are just creating that natural process. And it's funny that it's so controversial to the climate change narrative.
It's really a cult. It's a cult, religion-like cult, that they don't question the dogmas that have been set before them, and just to show how deep the indoctrination goes, I'm sure you as well saw the movie Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore in kindergarten, maybe grade 1.
Yep.
And you have kindergartners and people in elementary school like Greta Thunberg that are somehow experts on the climate, who just get pushed in front of everybody. It's really silly, actually.
Well, they were scaring us a lot growing up. There was a lot of propaganda that was frightening me about what was happening to the world. It was messed up that the world was constantly on the verge of collapse so many times. Their prophecies don't ever seem to come true.
There was almost an ice age in the 70s. They were predicting an ice age, right? And then they were predicting that we'd run out of oil, and now we found that we have more oil reserves than we can ever know what to do with. So let's just look at this astrophysicist comment on the impact of the sun and how it is completely overlooked and not even spoken about, right? They talk about climate cycles and the sun isn't brought up. It's really insane. So here, let's take a look at this.
We have very clear evidence quantifying the effect of the sun, and we can show beyond any doubt that the sun has a large effect on climate. And that effect is totally ignored by mainstream climatology because it would upset the whole standard lore. Yeah, you'll have to change it.
So let's just comment on that quickly. The fact that it even needs to be mentioned that the sun has an impact on the planet's climate is really insane, right?
Yeah, it has to be this massive, massive celestial body that is really like the driving force of life on Earth and of the cycles that occur on Earth. This is so essential for people to understand that you cannot make a claim that humans are causing massive changes in cycles on the Earth without factoring the sun in. And what he said there about the fact that the influence of the sun is omitted entirely in the climate change narrative. So it's not even like they say this much is the sun and this much is people. No, they're just saying it's all people, forget about the sun, ignore the sun, which it just takes a little bit of common sense to consider the reality of that. And you know what's funny, actually? If you look at that YouTube video, underneath it, YouTube has put a little warning, making sure that people know that this is challenging the climate change narrative. Incredibly, you can't even post that on YouTube without them flagging it and putting a little Wikipedia note about, staying beholden to the climate change narrative. So even just basically mentioning the influence of the sun, that triggers algorithms. That's how crazy this is. Yeah, there it is right there.
Climate
The
change,
context.
United Nations. It's really
There it is
absurd.
from the UN. So it's
So
like,
you can't say the word climate change or the term climate change and
Yeah.
not have some kind of note like this on Facebook, on Instagram, everywhere.
that's right. And so
But
the
so-
debate is squashed.
Oh, completely. There's this idea that science is settled. Science can't be settled. It's literally it's an oxymoron to say science is settled, right? It's paradoxical. It's the very nature of science. Science is a process. It's not something that can ever be settled. Even the theory of relativity, Newtonian gravity, the way we manipulate atoms, like all of these things are constantly changing, and our understanding of them is constantly changing. And what we have to understand is that these are conventions. The way science works is you have paradigms. You have scientific paradigms that are developed over time, and we work within these scientific paradigms. But they're conventions that we use to develop knowledge, and we need these paradigms to gain more knowledge in any particular field. But so going back to this climate modeling and omitting the effects of the sun, climate science today is essentially just statistics. You have all of these people that make models. There's different thermometers and buoys in the ocean that grab different thermometers in all kinds of different places, and they don't even account for the fact that they have them in big metropolises and then out in the country and the variations there. Climate science today is just modeling, it's statistics, and they omit the most important driver of climate in these models. So at face value, the modeling of the climate scientists today is complete nonsense. So when we're talking about the policies after the fact, like Pierre Poilievre and Danielle Smith, we need to, before talking about the policies, we need to get back to the foundation and point out to Justin Trudeau and these clowns like John Kerry and Al Gore, who's freaking out at the WEF and the United Nations, like he's losing his mind, just touting these talking points that he has. The oceans are on fire, and it's like, all right, just back up your claims a little bit. This is insane.
But you make a really interesting point, is models. Models is what was used to drive COVID and all the COVID policies. You have models being used to drive the climate change agenda. And in fact, you have models being used for a lot of the vaccines and the vaccine schedule growing. All of that is models as well. So it would appear that models plus propaganda is a consistent operation in what we're looking at here. And all they have to do is inject a model, then build a narrative on top of that model. It's pretty familiar territory at this point.
You know what? That's actually great, because what we want to do with this show is to point out these tactics that they have, and we need to find ways to tear them apart and use them against them. So it's very important that we recognize these patterns, and that's a very important one. These models are pseudoscience. But
Yeah.
it doesn't matter because they have an emotional effect when you present them, right? There's something called
Yes.
the hockey stick graph by Michael Moore. And we've all seen this graph that shows that the history of the climate has gone like this. And then in 1990 to 2010, it's gone like this. It's complete BS. It's shortened the graph. It's manipulated the statistic so that it's looking at this particular period where right before that, it was actually up here, even higher than it is here, right? I can put an example of a graph like that where it's manipulated, and they can manipulate anything, right? So today they're manipulating words. They're manipulating simple words like male and female. That is their MO. That is the MO of the left. And they're masters at it. They're masters at using rhetoric and altering it to confuse us and make it so that we don't even know how to have the argument back. We don't even know how to approach it because it's so absurd. It's so silly, right?
Yep.
The fact that this guy has to point out that the sun has an effect on the climate is ridiculous. Let's watch a little bit more of this guy because he goes into the cycles of the ocean a little bit more here.
It's good stuff. This is a YouTube channel called Friends of Science. They're worth a follow, I would say. They have some good dissenting content.
Yeah. There's another gentleman. His name's evading me right now, but I'll put a little clip of him here because his work is amazing.
Now, the fact that we see a lot of heat going into the oceans over the solar cycle tells us that there must be some other mechanism taking place. And the mechanism that has the most amount of evidence to support it is the indirect mechanism by which solar activity modulates the flux of high energy particles coming to Earth, which are called cosmic rays. And these cosmic rays are known to dominate the atmospheric ionization. And we now see evidence, both in the lab and in situ, that if you change this amount of ionization, you affect the cloud properties. The standard picture of global warming is wrong because it's missing the indirect effect that the sun has, and which we can see by looking at the ocean.
Okay, a lot of interesting points he brought up there. So there's the fact that the sun, first of all, varies in all kinds of ways. It has solar flares. The sun is essentially a billion nuclear bombs going off at once every second. And there's these things called solar flares that are essentially these huge explosions on the sun that release something that looks like a flare. And photons from the sun hit the earth about 8 minutes after they occur on the sun. So the sun, without even thinking about it too deeply, clearly when the sun has this abnormal activity, the earth will respond in kind, right?
Yep, 100%. There's a very important relationship going on there. And I think, even just getting into the depth that guy got into, this is an astrophysicist who's gone deeply into this. What we should be having is just public debates with someone who's in that position and a scientist, a high-level scientist who supports the climate change narrative, and have a real, normal, respectful debate. But this is what's not happening. When you can't even have the conversations, when you can't even get thought leaders together in the public square to have a powerful debate about something like this, then you know that the side that's being pushed they don't have a foundation. They can't defend it. If they can't bring it into the public square and go and have a debate with someone like that, then we know they don't have the evidence to defend it. And so we have to look at what's really going on here. And as per usual, we end up at this idea of reordering power in the world so that nation states have less power. Entities like the World Health Organization, the United Nations, the World Economic Forum end up more empowered. All these narratives seem to point to those globalist organizations needing more power over nation states. All these narratives sort of they all coincide right there. It's sort of like Trudeau funding. He gave a whole bunch of taxpayer money to the World Economic Forum to fund a carbon capture study. And then when it came time for Trudeau to implement a policy on carbon capture, he cited the study from the World Economic Forum that he had used Canadian taxpayer money to fund. So all of this seems to be funneling power up to these entities. And that's why it's important to look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is not the developmental goals of a humanitarian organization at the top of the world. This is a corrupt organization waging war. And so when you go and look at those documents, you're looking at a map of their warfare strategy. That's the way to look at it, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to stop and take a step back whenever you see censorship. And whenever there is a stifling of debate, whenever there is one side that says, we don't need to talk about this. You're wrong. This is the final answer. And particularly when that answer or that claim that they make leads to them getting more power, right?
Yeah.
The whole thing happened with COVID. There's an important distinction to make in this climate change world, which is there's people that are true believers that are just in the religion, like Justin Trudeau, who is so scientifically illiterate. There's people like that are so indoctrinated from such a young age, and they identify with this. It's this hero complex that
Yeah.
a lot of people on the left have, and a lot of people have either identified with climate change, with this transgender movement, with now this Palestinian movement, with this Ukrainian movement. They incorporate it into their idea of themselves. And that's why it's such a combative topic whenever you approach it. Instead of just having a natural discussion, a debate about it, it's like you're attacking their person, their character.
Yeah.
But so that's one side of it, is the people that truly believe it. And then there's the people that are using it as a tool to gain more power and to get this global hegemony, this global power structure, new world order that is not a conspiracy theory. It's in their own words. You listen to people like Klaus Schwab and George Soros at the World Economic Forum, and they believe that it's necessary to have a world government that's going to essentially make the peasants and us people that are, uninformed and stupid, and rectify all of our mistakes in our daily lives. So that's an important distinction to make, and to see the censorship that is so rampant, even on a video like this, you have to stop and question it.
You're so right, because I mean, this is similar. It's similar to, like me encountering the Marxists that I encountered here in Toronto, actually going and meeting them and recognizing that these are my neighbors who have been psychologically operated on. These are not my enemies. My enemies are the people driving the psychological operations at the top. And so
That's
like
a very
knowing
good
who
point.
because it is a tactic of our true enemy to have us hate our neighbors, to have us sense a sense in our body that our neighbor is our enemy. This is precisely what they want. And they want us increasingly in echo chambers where we lose access to people that don't think like us. And we need access to people that don't think like us. And that's a big part of what I'm saying about the loss of our capacity to debate, to take these big issues and have real meaningful debates. That doesn't happen in an environment that's been so polarized by the specific types of manipulation you're mentioning, right? When they use emotionally charged propaganda that ties a narrative into people's personal identities, you're absolutely right. Because when you're challenging these narratives, they feel unstable because their sense of themselves is being attacked. And so all of this plays into this whole mess of increasing division of the population. So this is what we need to be against. So if you have someone in your life who is deeply tied into the climate change narrative, it's important to recognize that they shouldn't be seen as an enemy. This is someone who's been psychologically operated on and perhaps could be led away from that, with enough understanding, or maybe you could set up a space for debate. This is always, I think, a good goal. At the same time, some people are so beholden to it, they're unable to have any kind of meaningful discussion. And that's up to you on a circumstance by circumstance basis, what kind of judgment call you're going to make. But the point is that we are being increasingly divided into different camps. And social media is a big part of this. We all know that our social media feed is designed to create echo chambers. So I do my best to try to get out of those echo chambers and look at people who are at least trying to straddle this on different sides, who are maybe, looking to create dissent, looking to have discussions about it. It's super important because we want to disempower the globalists who have created these divisive scenarios through this kind of narrative warfare. And we want to try to bring things back into a place for debate and discussion. And to an extent, I would say that X is starting to do more of that. I'm starting to see more like spaces and things that are hosted where people who deeply disagree are actually getting into spaces and hashing it out. That's
Well,
so
Alex
so
Jones.
important.
Alex
Yes.
Jones on, I don't know if
Yes.
I don't know if you saw the debate he had about January 6th. Anything involving Alex Jones is not really a debate. He just yells, and it's not very constructive, but at the same time there was Glenn Greenwald and Darren Beattie there, and they were the calming forces involved in this. So it was Alex Jones, Darren Beattie, and Glenn Greenwald against these three leftists that believe January 6th was, just as bad as Pearl Harbor and 9/11, which is absurd. But so Alex Jones, just the fact that Alex Jones has a platform now, and that
Yeah.
people actually, these three leftists they're like the Krankenstein brothers, and this guy, he has a stupid Destiny. I don't know what the hell, he has a stupid name. But so the fact that these three leftists decided to come onto the Alex Jones show and actually debate about it is great. It's honestly a great thing, because that means that they actually have conviction in their ideas. I think their ideas are nonsense, but the fact that they actually want to duke it out, and it's clear to me that they weren't there to actually listen to anything. They were just there to make their point. But it's a very good thing to have. And you make a great point. We need to understand that these people in power, they love that we are arguing over gender. They love that we are arguing over climate change and all this stuff. As long as we're not arguing about the national debt and how corrupt all our politicians are, and how broken the system is, and how corrupt it is from the ground up, and how it almost needs to be completely torn down, they're having a field day, right?
Yeah. The major takeaway for me is, in fifth generation warfare, especially when we have a globalist agenda, you want to be able to see the uniparty, and the uniparty really, you have to recognize that this is the party that goes across all the different political lines, the political wings across the political spectrum. That's why it's important to recognize that there are conservative politicians who are still beholden to the climate change narrative, even though they pretend to dissent a bit. You have to be able to point out, call out the uniparty, all politicians on all sides of the spectrum that are feeding this shift of power towards globalism. They need to be identified and called out. We can't get caught up in the left-wing, right-wing thing. And I think Canada's got a big problem with the uniparty. So if there's a simple takeaway in terms of politics, you want to try to find and support leaders who are not part of that uniparty.
Yeah. So on that note, it seems like a lost cause to try to have conversations with a lot of people that are, stark leftists that seem to have lost their mind a little bit, or are just hysterical in any of these discussions. But we do need to kind of find a way to communicate with the people that are reasonable, that hold these ideas, that are reasonable, and that are like us, that maybe leaned a little bit left. And there's this quote that I tout all the time. I think it's Winston Churchill, but it's, if you're not a liberal when you're young, you don't have a heart, and if you don't become conservative as you get older, you don't have a brain. Because I mean, that's a little bit abstract, because liberal, conservative, those things have shifted completely, right? But the idea is liberalism is change. Liberalism is the idea, it's progressivism, it's the idea that things need to change, and things do need to change to a certain extent, because things are always changing in just in our technology, but then in the way we live in cities and blah, blah, blah. So things do need to change. But then the conservative side of things is, all right, yes, things need to change, but we need to conserve this structure that has gotten us here, that has created the most abundance, the highest standard of living in human history, right? So there's an important interplay between those two philosophies, or those two political ideas. But the problem is, one side has gotten so absurd, and that's become a very mainstream part of the left. So we need to find the people that are really center, that can still have discussions.
Yeah, 100%. You're totally right. Going back to the philosophy of conservatism and progressivism, looking at them just as philosophies, as yin and yang, that need to be constantly playing off of each other. Of course, for humanity to grow and evolve but maintain stability, we need a constant interplay of that which is progressive and that which is conservative. So it's true. The idea, and this is one of the sort of psyops that's really impacted the psychological, or the political realm, I should say, is this belief that's been now embedded in both sides, that the way forward is more and more people to be conservative, or the way forward is for everyone to be progressive. And that illusion in and of itself has become dangerous. So you're totally right. And I think sometimes we have to reconcile the fact that the left has been infiltrated by the globalist operations in ways that are unique and that have pushed the left into a very illogical place. That being said, there's still infiltration that's happening on the right. There's still manipulations coming from there. And so when we go back to the heart of it philosophically, like you're saying, that's when I think we get a clear picture of, in each different circumstance, how do we want that yin and that yang to play out? How and where would it be balanced? And how can we bring things back to proper debate between those two forces? And, I'll say there's a lot of left-wing people that use the hashtag politically homeless. I've seen this many, many times. When I was doing research for my film Cut,
Cool,
I found a lot of people. It's actually pretty interesting because you have left-wing people that are still free thinkers who will push back against any of these agendas. Could be the COVID agenda, climate change, gender affirmative care, and they all of a sudden get attacked as right-wing extremists. And these are lifelong progressive Democrats who now feel politically homeless because they can't dissent against any of these narratives without being called a right-wing extremist. Those are the kinds of people.
Trump was technically a Democrat. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yes,
Trump was technically a Democrat his whole life, right?
He was one of the major donors to the Democrat Party. He was donating to Hillary Clinton's party and all that beforehand. So 100%, we need to, and you need to find those people. They get kind of buried. Dissenting left-wing people get really buried, and I really do my best to try to find them, to seek those people out. That was the big thing that I was doing when I was working on Cut, was looking for the left-wing people that are dissenting against this. Because when you find them, you start to realize that we not only have issues like gender affirmative care, for example, where the entire right wing is against it, but it's actually way more left-wing people than you would believe. And you have the radical small group being uplifted. That a lot of the time that's the case. You have the most radical left-wing voices being uplifted, and the illusion that this is the entire left is presented to us. We got to watch out for that sort of apolitical warfare as well.
Yeah, they're a very loud minority, and the people that are pushing these agendas, they know how to weaponize boots on the ground and make it look like it is a lot bigger than it is. And it's a Saul Alinsky tactic where you have pressure from below and pressure from above. So you have these seemingly grassroots movements that are actually, probably paid for by NGOs. And they make this statement and they make it seem like there's this pressure from the grassroots. And then you have politicians that can come and say, oh, well, this is what the people want, democracy, blah, 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 all the buzzwords. And then that tactic is really powerful, and it's been used so many times. Yep. So let's actually shift to another side of the climate change debate and the energy policy debate. And it's a side that's very much overlooked. The way I could summarize it is that fossil fuels have created the most prosperity in human history for the Western world and then for the rest of the world as well. China has brought 400 million people out of poverty through industrialization and through the use of fossil fuels. And when we make fossil fuels more scarce, when we make energy more scarce, then the poorest people in the world suffer. So we all benefit from this easy access to energy, to cheap energy. But when we make energy more expensive, we suffer. Yes, our energy bills go up. And if you look at Germany, their energy costs have increased in an insane amount that it's unsustainable. But the people that really suffer are the people in the third world that are trying to industrialize, that are trying to develop. They can't get access to this cheap, reliable energy. So let's watch this little video and we can deliberate on it after the fact.
It's going to happen in Europe and around the world, likely this winter, as we put tremendous stress on poor people by jacking up energy and food prices, is the idea that we can make the planet more habitable on the environmental front by impoverishing poor people, by raising energy prices and food prices. It's not only absurd logically, but I think it's tantamount to genocidal in its intent. It's really appalling.
It creates grave danger for those who are on fixed income going into an environment, especially in our northern climates, January, February, March, April. It's dangerous not to have reliable power, not to be able to have reliable home heating. And we have to be mindful that, as you say, the people most impacted by that are the ones at the lower end of the income scale. And so if you are forcing a senior citizen to make a choice of reducing their food bill or reducing their pharmaceuticals so that they can keep their electricity and their heating on, those are not decisions that any government should be forcing their people to make.
Look at what's going to happen in Europe and around the world.
Yep. There it is. It's interesting because You have Jordan Peterson pointing out the grave suffering that this is going to cause for, people who are poor and are struggling and have these certain kinds of instability in their lives. And then at the same time, you have the climate change narrative saying that global warming is going to impact poor people the worst, and that climate change is actually more dangerous for the impoverished and for minorities. They also have that, that climate change is more dangerous for minorities, more dangerous for people of color. They have all those narratives ongoing. So it's so incredibly deceptive, because on the one hand, they're saying we have these initiatives because we're trying to protect all the poor people and the minorities, when the actual truth is the inversion, is that their policies are directly hurting and endangering those impoverished and minority groups.
Just like many of their ideologies, it's completely backwards. And it doesn't take much thinking to understand that if costs of energy goes up, it makes it harder for people that are already on a low or fixed income, that are monitoring how much their energy bills are. And if they have kids and if they have to feed their kids, well, they have to keep their kids warm. They need energy to keep the lights on, right? So we're really seeing this in Alberta right now at minus 40, minus 50. They're asking people in Alberta to lower their energy consumptions in peak hours. That should not be a reality in Canada. Canada is one of the most prosperous nations in the world. We have one of the most resources in every department. If you talk about oil, natural gas, minerals, everything, water, we should be able to be essentially one of the countries with the higher standard of living in the world. So it's a perfect example actually for this worldwide climate change debate or discussion about policies that are completely damaging the world and people. The way this philosopher, Alex Epstein, he calls himself a philosopher, but he's an expert in this climate change world and energy. He calls it an anti-human environmentalist movement because it doesn't care. It touts this idea that we're hurting the environment, and it's anti-human in the sense that you have people like Bill Gates saying we need to lower the population. So they don't want human flourishing. They want this abstract idea of protecting the planet. But the reality is that climate-related deaths, meaning deaths from tornadoes, from hurricanes, from tsunamis, have decreased by 98% since the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the use of fossil fuels. So these third world countries that are trying to develop, they're trying to build up an infrastructure to protect them against nature, to protect them against their environment, because the environment is inherently dangerous. So for us to be able to flourish, and for these people that are trying to develop, it is doing them a huge disservice. And it's not only a huge disservice, Jordan Peterson puts it's tantamount to genocide, because if you can't get energy, you can't get clean water, you can't get food. It's not just this, it's this weird abstract idea that people need energy to keep the lights on and do their cars. No, everything relies on energy. Everything relies on how effective we are at using our resources and using machinery to get things places. They're so unidimensional in their thinking and so childish in their thinking that they don't see the repercussions of this down the line, which are so simple. A simple discussion. Right? I don't understand how these debates aren't happening, but
it's incredible. And you're right, like that the abstract notion of the environment or the planet as a victim, as this victimized entity. It's very interesting the way they've done that and the way they've weaponized the concept of the environment to create this kind of like bleeding heart sentimentality that the environment, this weird thing, this sort of character they've made, is constantly suffering due to the human presence. This manipulation works on many, many people, when in many ways, the opposite is true. The truth is that the environment, in so many ways, is constantly trying to kill humans, right? Like, we have had to overcome so much to develop as a humanity. When you look at the spread of disease and you look at natural disasters and you look at animals, and like, there's so many ways the environment is trying to kill humans that you can't look at it with this bizarre myopic lens that paints the environment as a victim of humanity. There is going to be a constant struggle for humans to survive. That's just the way life is on the planet. We have to do things to combat all the forces in nature that will kill us if we don't develop correctly. And so, like, to get a balanced notion of what the environment is, there's actually a lot of philosophy going on there. There's a big struggle even to separate us from the earth, from the environment. There's some arguments that it's like, well, when are we us and when are we the environment? Because are we not part of it as well? So, you look at all the different ways that we could frame the human relationship with the earth and the environment, and you start to realize that the way they have framed it is so incredibly narrow-minded that it squashes all debate, and it manipulates people in a way that they don't even understand what it means to support basic human survival. Like, that's how absurd it's gotten. The situation in Alberta is a great example of that. The environment will kill us if we don't have the correct infrastructure. This is something that cavemen learned to understand.
It's crazy,
it's
right?
So bonkers.
Yeah. And so they're literally, so Rachel Notley, who was the premier before Danielle Smith, did everything in her power to stifle Alberta's energy production in the energy sector. So Canada has the third biggest reserve of natural gas and oil, and I'm not sure if it's coal as well, maybe the sixth in coal, something along those lines. But we can't refine it here. So this is how absurd it is. They've made it, and we can't transport it either. They've stopped these pipelines, right? So this is how absurd it is. They have to drill for oil and fracking and all the stuff, and it's so expensive to even get a permit for it. So they've stopped doing it altogether. But so then they have to transport it by truck or by train to the States to get refined and then bring it back. So it's really absurd. But so to piggyback on what you were saying, this idea that the planet is this fragile thing is really silly. It's easy for people to create the narrative or the illusion that, human beings, clearly with the smokestack, one picture of a smokestack and the whole planet, you can picture the whole planet kind of going up in flames, right? It's like the turtle with a straw in its nose, right? And now plastic straws are no longer a thing. But so there's an important distinction to make between pollution and emissions. Okay. So pollution is a problem. Plastic pollution, air pollution, these are things that we have to account for. Emissions and carbon dioxide, this is what you're saying, it's so myopic. The only thing that they understand, that Justin Trudeau understands, is carbon dioxide affecting the climate. And it's not even clear, this is an important thing. It's not even clear that carbon dioxide is heating up the planet versus the sun heating up the planet, and then carbon dioxide storages in the ocean being released. So there's a weird interplay there. And then there's another whole discussion that we won't be able to get into now, that this greenhouse gas effect, it's actually horrible science. It's pseudo-science, because it's built on the idea of a greenhouse, which is this tiny, rectangular structure, as opposed to the planet, which is this huge sphere, unless you're a flat earther, but this huge sphere that doesn't behave in the same way as a little greenhouse, that keeps heat in. So this whole discussion, so we're not going to talk about that now. Maybe we'll do a whole nother talk on the greenhouse effect, because it's really interesting. It's really interesting how it's something that has just been assumed for so long, and we accept it as this dogma in science and in the climate change science world, but it's very flawed as a theory itself. Yeah. George Carlin, I don't know if you've seen this bit. He's talking about our effect on the earth. And he's like, everybody's always worried about the earth. Save the trees, save the bees, save the whales, save those snails. And so he goes into this whole bit about the earth will shake us off like fleas. We are nothing to the planet. The planet will be completely fine. We are going to be fucked. So that's kind of funny, because the idea is that we're going to ruin the environment for ourselves, and then we're not going to, the planet won't be livable anymore. But that's also not true. Our effect on the planet is not making it uninhabitable for human beings, especially as we use more fossil fuels and more innovation. The more efficient we get, the cleaner we're going to be able to make the whole world and the environment.
Yeah, it is being blown up in a lot of ways, like all this narrative. I noticed that Tucker Carlson recently did a big piece on the global warming and fossil fuel scam. And, so that's going out to millions of people. But I think there's a deeper part of this. I have to do a little bit of shameless self-promotion here. I put out a free email course called Navigating the Cognitive Battlefield. And one of the main things it focuses on is how, since the Industrial Revolution, the brain of Western citizens has become entrenched in the left hemisphere. And this is important because our left hemisphere really, really wants overly simplistic reductionist narratives that are very simple and easy to understand and that don't require a lot of debate and doubt. It doesn't require having to consider multiple truths or contradictions. So the left hemisphere entrenchment of the Western world makes these overly simplistic narratives very, very tempting. And this is just like a natural result of the Industrial Revolution when we became more sort of enamored with the material world. But it's something that not a lot of people are aware of. And it's one of the reasons I put out this free course, because I want people to see this, that when you're handed a narrative that's something like the greenhouse effect, it's very, very tantalizing for the left hemisphere entrenched Western brain to think of the Earth like a little greenhouse that just traps heat, and it's nice and simple, and it could be drawn to the little kids cartoon. It's so tempting, you know?
It's so funny, actually. If you can explain the whole theory with a little cartoon thing, it's probably not very well thought out, but
Exactly.
it's one of those things that we don't even think twice about, right? I don't know if
Yeah.
you've ever thought about this. Most people haven't, but I came across this solar physicist and he's explaining how this whole thing is nonsense, you know, but we don't think about it, and we just make these simple, you're right, our left hemisphere just latches onto it, and it's like, oh, I'm smarter now, you know, I'm gonna say this, and look at me, I'm very smart, but we don't really put much thought into them.
Yep, 100%. So, I mean, that's the nature of the cognitive battlefield right now. We have to be mindful of that on all sides. Even in the more conspiratorial spaces, sometimes we're handed something that seems like an overly simplistic idea of what's going on, a theory of who the bad guy is and what they're up to. Even that, we have to be mindful. And for me, the practice that I found that is best to engage in is doubt, is to regularly let yourself rest in doubt. Be comfortable with doubt. Be comfortable being in places of doubt, of being doubtful about what's going on. It's not easy to assess what's going on right now. We live in the most sophisticated war in all of human history. So it's okay to be doubtful. It's okay to be uncertain. And it's okay to consider multiple contradictory truths and possibilities. That's healthy cognition. That's how we refine discernment. You know, discernment requires doubt. And if you're not going through states of natural doubt where you're comfortable with it, then likely you're sort of getting stuck in narrative warfare that, you know, it can occur anywhere in any information source that you're engaging in.
Yeah, the right does it a lot too. Unfortunately, we latch on to narratives, and what I would say is, and I've found myself doing it, I'm sure you have as well. Most people do. We kind of latch onto these ideas that we've thought through, we've made sense of them, and then we don't actually then go and question the foundation of it. But what I would say, to reiterate what you said, is just question your convictions, because we all have these strong convictions, but we're likely going to amend those convictions as we live and as we grow and as we have more conversations. So Simon, let's watch one last video and then let's cap it off, because this has been a good long talk.
All right.
Let's see.
Logically, where the policies of those on the extreme green left have led to is that they are now sacrificing those at the lower end of the income scale, which they say that that's who they care about. But it's just demonstrably untrue when you see the impact of. When you look at some of the most impoverished countries in the world, they're using wood and dung and coal to heat their homes. I talked to somebody, a researcher in British Columbia, who said we have 44 million deaths per year because of indoor air quality problems. And so why is that not elevated as an issue that we know we can solve by having these secure types of energy? LNG is going to be a solution. This is logical.
Oh yeah.
So that last part of people, we take this for granted that we have proper ventilation and we have, you know, air exchangers, and constantly we're cleaning out air in condo buildings and, you know, in houses, and, you know, ventilation and HVAC is a whole industry that is focused on keeping air clean. Many people don't even know about it, actually, tell you the truth. I'm in construction world, so I'm quite familiar with it, but we take that for granted. Even the advent of the vacuum cleaner improved air quality in people's houses, but we take for granted the fact that 150 years ago, or even 100 years ago, and today for many people, we had to heat our houses with fireplaces inside the house, and the air quality, you know, I don't know if you've ever been around a campfire, I'm sure you have. When you leave the campfire, you've breathed in so much smoke that your lungs are severely affected. So there's all these things we take for granted that is thanks to energy, is thanks to the proliferation of fossil fuels around the world. And we really, it's so backwards, the understanding of fossil fuels. Like, we should be praising the fact that we have developed ways to use fossil fuels in such efficient ways. The other side of it is nuclear energy, which we can talk about in the future, which for some weird reason, the same people that hate fossil fuels hate nuclear energy, even though it would be the cleanest form of energy with zero emissions. There's this boogeyman idea that it is very unsafe, but the technology today has made it that it is so safe. And Bjorn Lomborg has a whole TED talk about it, and we can, plenty of people talk about it, but there's so much red tape around nuclear energy that it's impossible to open a nuclear plant these days.
Well, and I'll plant a seed that we can go down a rabbit hole in another episode of suppressed energy technologies, because I've done years of research into that there are clean energy technologies that are likely suppressed that would change the entire narrative for all of this, that would wipe a lot of these energies off the map. But they are not the kind of energy technology that can be centralized and used to generate massive amounts of wealth and control over people. And so there's the possibility that there are incredible clean energy technologies that have been suppressed for decades. I think that's a huge part of this, a big part that gets missed in a lot of the conversations, that it seems to be the case that there are technologies being used by militaries in Canada and the US that would make this whole debate seem absolutely absurd, that aren't even being discussed. So that's a rabbit hole that we could go down for another day to maybe flip this narrative on its head once more.
Yeah, I'll just give one last comment to that, which is, when I was younger, I probably used the term big oil. At the time, I was liberal and just hadn't really thought. I was a teenager. So I had this idea that big oil has, this narrative that is pushing oil and doesn't care about climate change. But a more interesting thing to think about is nuclear would decimate the oil industry, right? If nuclear became the standard form of energy, the oil industry would be destroyed. So there's definitely something to say about lobbying from the oil industry and these big oil companies, lobbying politicians to stop these other forms of energy. So definitely I'm looking forward to going down that rabbit hole. Other than that, Simon, this has been a fun one.
Yeah, this is
episode 2. If you've been listening this far, welcome. This is we're getting going with this, and we have plenty more to talk about. Canada is in dire straits at the moment, and it's a good example of how fifth generation warfare is being used, right? Because our politicians are completely in bed with these globalist forces.
Yeah, thanks for being tuned in this far, everyone who's here, and stay free-minded, and we'll see you guys on the next episode.
Yes, sir. Take care, folks.